Shabbat Shalom. I'm inviting you to switch gears and switch books, so you can place your Siddur, your prayer book, off to the side and take up the handout that was offered when you came into the sanctuary. If anyone needs one, just raise your hand and Mike has the leftovers. Anyone need a handout tonight? I'm sorry the print is small, but I wanted to make sure that there were enough copies for everyone without too many pieces of paper. We are studying a short passage, just 7 verses from the first chapter of the book of Exodus. And it is sandwiched between so much good and stirring material that it often gets overlooked. Within the first few chapters of the book of Exodus, we learn of the Israelites who have formed a community in the land of Egypt, have increased and multiplied greatly, have presented themselves in the eyes of a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, who arises over Egypt, not aware of or not caring about the incredible Jewish legacy of leadership that saved the people from starvation in his own land, and instead feels threatened by this growing Hebrew population. And so this wicked new Pharaoh imposes all sorts of draconian measures to suppress and oppress the Jewish population of Egypt. And before we get to the most famous story of Moses, under this edict of death, being floated down the Nile in a reed basket and being picked up by the maidservants in the very court of Pharaoh and being spared from death and growing to a position of maturity and awareness in the very palace of Pharaoh and witnessing a Hebrew being whipped by an Egyptian taskmaster, which incenses him so that he goes out and strikes down the taskmaster, killing him, and then flees for his life. All of that is just in the very first portion of the book of Exodus called Shemot. But here are 7 verses that, because there's so much good stuff, often get overlooked. And they invite us to consider the legacy of 2 lesser sung, if not unsung, heroes, or more properly, heroines of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish tradition, and I would say our civilization. And because I'm the only one with a microphone, and because we're live streaming the service, I'll be the one to read tonight, but there will be an interactive portion toward the end of this discussion. And I realized by watching a playback of the live stream from a couple weeks ago that if I do this too much, I go off camera. So I love all y'all on this side of the congregation, but I need to stay kind of in between this side and this side if I want to be seen on Hi, Facebook. Nice to see you. Let me begin. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Puah. Not enough Puahs out there, right? I heard you, Matthew. Yes, not enough. Right? Thanks, Josh. Don't name enough girls Puah these days. And we should, because she, like Shifra, is a true hero of the Hebrew Bible. The king said, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. In other words, examine the site where the child was born. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. It has been pointed out to me that if your object is to commit genocide against a population, this is all wrong. I'm not inviting us to consider how best or most efficiently to commit genocide, but you really want to kill the girls, right? Because killing the boys does not actually stop a population boom. Okay, bad science. Maybe it's meant for the reader to kind of poke fun at this Pharaoh. In addition to being brutal and dictatorial, he's also not so bright. The midwives, very key word here, hold it in your mind, fearing God, even more than fear. It's not the kind of fear that has you trembling under your bed. It's the kind of fear that manifests as religious reverence or awe. Out of awe and respect for God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they've given birth. Now, this sounds to me like a totally made-up excuse, which is not unreasonable given the fact that through this act of disobedience of the king's law, they have put themselves in a situation punishable by death. They have directly disobeyed an order of the Pharaoh, in whose hand was all of the power of Egypt. He could have them sentenced to death for this act of disobedience. And so they come up with some quick thinking and say, well, it's not so much that we tried to save the boys, it's just that the Hebrew women are spitting out those boys right and left before we can even get to them. They're that fertile. And God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. So for whatever reason, this seems to be a satisfactory answer to the Pharaoh, who comes up with a different stratagem. And God established households for the midwives because they feared God, or because they had reverence for God. And then Pharaoh, changing his strategy a bit, charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. In other words, I'm not going to leave this up to these midwives. Everyone in the entire society is now charged with following this new law. Everyone. No one is safe. And of course, that underscores the great danger that surrounds the birth and salvation of Moses when he's placed in that basket. His mother and his sister Miriam place Moses in that basket under penalty of death. So there's our story tonight. And I found a text that I think is meaningfully brought into dialogue with this ancient text. It is an excerpt, and a fairly short excerpt, from the famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote when he was serving a brief but important jail sentence in Birmingham, Alabama. There was no more brutally segregationist location in all of the South than Birmingham, Alabama. And starting months before April of 1963, King and his allies, his associates, developed a campaign known as the Birmingham Campaign of nonviolent resistance to the imposition of segregationist laws and old officials who refused to step out of the way in order to allow new officials who were anti-segregationists to rise and take their place. And so this campaign of nonviolent resistance led King and his followers and associates to travel to Birmingham and to begin demonstrating in the streets, to begin picketing and what have you. And he was arrested on April 12th, 1963, and someone sneaked into the jail a newspaper covering this act of disobedience and the fact that King, along with his associates Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttleworth and other protesters, he began to write a letter starting in the margins of the newspaper. It was also brought to his attention through the newspaper that a group of 8 white clergymen, Christian and, I regret to inform you, also Jewish, who wrote down in this op-ed how they were disappointed in and not supportive of King's methods of bringing awareness to the oppression and segregation that was taking place in Birmingham and throughout the Deep South. This is just one short excerpt from a text that is over 6,000 words long. The excerpt we're going to look at is 800 some odd words long, meaning about 1/8 of the total letter. You must, if you do nothing else this weekend, which commemorates the legacy of Dr. King, read the letter from a Birmingham jail. You'll see on TV the I Have a Dream speech, but this text, if you do not know it, is a must-read. So I'm going to read a section of it. I'm going to invite you to do this little exercise, and then I'll take a few comments. I would like for you to identify at least one thing in this talk, in this letter, that shifts your perspective, or that teaches you something you did not know about King, about the traditions that he is citing, about the civil rights movement. So something that either shifts your own perspective in thinking about civil disobedience, or that teaches you something you did not already know. That's your task. One may well ask, he writes, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine, one of the great fathers of the Catholic Church tradition, that an unjust law is no law at all. And by the way, pay attention to how many different religious authorities he cites in this document, religious and philosophical. Now, what is the difference between the two? How can you tell the difference between a just law and an unjust law? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, another church father, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. We probably wouldn't say personality today. We would probably say personhood, identity, humanness. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality or personhood. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship. It makes the relationship between two people purely transactional. You are just a thing to me, that's I-it. Whereas Buber taught that the higher form of relationship is when another person is seen and valued for his or her humanity, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right. Does anyone know which decision he's referring to? Brown versus Board of Ed, which officially desegregated schools at the federal level in the United States. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give you another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. In other words, if you were a disenfranchised group that couldn't vote, therefore your voice is excluded from these unjust laws. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. That's the term that would have been used in the 60s to describe African Americans or people who call themselves black. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. That's why he was in jail. Now, there's nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you are able to see the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. Wow, that is an obscure Bible reference. Does anyone know which biblical book, the Hebrew Bible, tells us about the civil disobedience of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego against the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, who was a great enemy of the Jewish people? Close. It's the book of Daniel. These were Daniel's three best buddies, and they, like Daniel, defied the order of the wicked Babylonian king on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians, who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. And in our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. It's the last paragraph we're going to quote because I think it really lands with a kind of final punch for us as a Jewish audience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was, quote, legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was, quote, illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. So here we have three incredible models of civil disobedience: Shifra and Pua on the one hand, and then their direct descendant, Dr. Martin Luther King. And now I'm going to come back to you. As you heard these words maybe for the first time or maybe for the 100th time, these words from Letter from a Birmingham Jail, did anything in your perspective about King's work and our work come to mind? Did you learn anything new, either about King, about civil disobedience, about your own Jewish tradition, or about other religious traditions that informed his thinking as a young civil rights leader? Or any other comments or questions you'd like to raise? I'd like to solicit from the congregation tonight three perspectives that you obtained from hearing these words. I'm very good, by the way, with the pregnant pause. Yes, please. Oh, and share who you are, please. Hi, Frank. All right, so just because a group is doing something does not make it right? And it's really interesting. There's another line in the letter from a Birmingham jail where King points out, quoting the great Presbyterian pastor, Christian pastor, Reinhold Niebuhr, that if a human being, an individual, is susceptible to be immoral, mobs or crowds are all the more so. That groups of people acting together are exceedingly vulnerable to doing the wrong thing. And so going along with a crowd is the surest way to abdicate personal moral responsibility. Great. What else? Yes, hi, Jordan. To be a leader, not a follower, right? And my favorite word in the whole section that I gave you is when King is talking about how you disobey a law. He uses an incredible adverb that I find very surprising. He says, lovingly. If you're going to be a leader, you do this out of love, right? You recognize that your choice is one that may get you in some serious hot water. King full well knew that he could and likely would go to jail for organizing these protests without a permit, and that whatever excuse they could come up with to use against him, they would and did. And yet to be a leader means that you accept the risks and the responsibilities of your leadership decisions, not just haphazardly, but lovingly. Thank you, Jordan. Maybe one more perspective shift. Yes, hi. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. I'm going to say it out loud so you can hear it on the microphone, but what struck Lisa, the perspective that shifted for her, was how his words build bridges of commonality with other oppressed groups, ethnic or religious minorities. In other words, if you read the whole letter, it is clear that he is talking about the condition of Black America. But he is also identifying with the early Christians who were persecuted by the Romans, and with Jews who have been persecuted time and again, both in biblical times and it was very recently for King. In 1963 was only 15 years removed from or 17 years removed from the end of the Holocaust, right? That's the blink of an eye. And the way in which I think that there's so many references to Jewish suffering and Jewish civil disobedience really builds a kind of sense of commonality and common identity. Bruce. Go for it. Or Rachel, hi. Do you think there's work to go in Birmingham and in America?
Well, I haven't lived in Birmingham in quite some time, but I can tell you that it was very, unfortunately, it was where I grew up, it was very segregated in the 90s, 80s and 90s. So they had gotten, I guess, further along, but not quite as far as.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think, and I just want to follow up on this thing, maybe this comes from my prosecution background, but I think the other thing I gleaned from this is that you're saying this would surprise me, that if laws which we might consider to be unfair but not morally unjust were meted out fairly on the entire populace in a demographically correct fashion, there wouldn't be the same basis for civil disobedience that we seem to see.
100%. So you have homework to do. You have to go home this weekend, and before the holiday is up on Monday night, read the rest of Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Read it with your kids. Read it with your parents. Read it by yourself. Make it your Shabbat study text this Shabbat as we converge on the sacred encounter with our story of slavery and freedom, recognizing once again what Shifra and Pua understood, that A, there is a law higher than even the highest law in the land. They feared God's law, and they gave no heed to the Pharaoh's edict. And two, as King taught us, that freedom is never freely given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Shabbat Shalom.